Tonight, Southeast Asian currencies take another hammering. Another bid by Australia to fight Asian perceptions of racism. And chaos in Hong Kong when a traffic accident kills 2 people. Good evening, Rosemary Church with Australia Television News. Foreign investors fled Southeast Asian stock markets today as embattled currencies dived to record lows, dealing a body blow to regional confidence. Within minutes of markets opening, Hong Kong and Singapore shares had tumbled more than 5%, while Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur were also besieged. The Australian government is closely monitoring the instability.
After a day of historic lows yesterday, today the mood continued. Brokers say it's now a herd mentality. Many investors are selling for the sake of it. Across Southeast Asia, stock markets were down 3% in Malaysia, 4% in Thailand, 5% in Indonesia and 2.4% in the Philippines. In Sydney, Foreign Minister Alexander Downer was watching the developments in Southeast Asia.
Obviously, as a government, we, amongst others in the region, have been very focused on the problems that the Thai economy has encountered. Those problems have certainly had a ripple effect into some of the neighbouring economies.
It was Mr Downer who campaigned for the $1 billion bailout of the Thai economy. This week, that move was praised by regional leaders.
I think the Australian participation has probably been the most significant diplomatic move on the part of Australia to identify itself with Southeast Asia.
That's the praise that the Australian government has been looking for. But there's concern here that the rescue effort has failed to confine the slide to the Thai baht. Southeast Asian currency movements this week have been in one direction only. The Thai baht down 4%, the Malaysian ringgit down 5%, the Indonesian Rupiah down 12%.
I think it's a concern in countries where it clearly reflects mismanagement on the part of the authorities, and I would say Thailand is a classic case of that. I think it's less of a concern where this bandwagon effect from market to market has swept up countries where the management has traditionally been better.
It's been an horrific week for Southeast Asian governments. Economists are divided, but most predict a partial recovery when markets reopen on Monday.
The Australian government has taken another step to fight perceptions in Asia that Australia is a racist country. Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock has launched a campaign kit which he'll take to several Southeast Asian nations next week.
The kit of posters and brochures depicts immigrants from a variety of ethnic backgrounds at work and at play. The Minister says it's designed to dispel myths about immigration policy and to reaffirm Australia's commitment to a culturally diverse and open society. But Mr Ruddock said there was room for legitimate debate about the number and composition of immigrants allowed into the country.
We don't want distorted debate. We want discussion, reasonable discussion about issues that ought to be capable of debate in a community, in a democracy like ours. If debate is not based on tolerance and respect for everything that Australia stands for, it can do our nation enormous harm.
The information campaign is widely perceived as a response to the damaging impact of the independent Member of Parliament, Pauline Hanson, who has advocated an end to Asian immigration. The Immigration Minister wouldn't be drawn on questions about Ms Hanson, saying the government preferred to be judged by its actions.
When you have the Chief Financial Officer of Hong Kong saying that when Australia joins in a rescue package of one of the key Asian economies within our region to ensure that we have stability within our region, to ensure that we have stable markets for our own goods and services and that we have effective relationships within our region, that says more about Australia and Australians than any amount of posturing.
Mr Ruddock leaves next Thursday for a tour of Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, China and the Philippines.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has just finished his own tour of the region. He visited China, Japan and South Korea. And he's called on South Korea to help Israel stop the movement of missiles between North Korea and the Middle East. The Israeli Prime Minister made his comments after a tour of the heavily guarded demilitarised zone which separates the two Koreas.
Mr Netanyahu declined to be drawn on this week's defection to the United States of a North Korean ambassador. But he did make some comparisons between the border situations facing South Korea and his own country, noting the Korean border covered a much longer front than Israel's border with Syria.
It has different topographical and geographical considerations, and the array of forces on either side, the composition of the forces is different from our situation. So I would hope that we achieve peace with Syria, but how to ensure the security, which is the foundation of that peace, is something that we'll have to examine by visits to the north of our country, more than the north of this country, as you can imagine.
Mr Netanyahu said Israel was keen to provide defence and other advanced technology to South Korea, thought to include unmanned attack planes. In exchange, he wants greater South Korean investment in his country.
South Korea's Red Cross, meanwhile, has notified North Korea that it's ready to ship another 9,000 tonnes of food aid. It'll be the fourth consignment to be sent to the famine-stricken north. And it's part of South Korea's pledge to send 50,000 tonnes of food before the end of September. A Red Cross spokesman who's recently visited the north says there's obvious malnutrition everywhere and that people were disappearing into their homes to die silently. An estimated 70% of this year's maize crop was wiped out by a 2-month drought. And a South Korean television crew has been attacked by guards as it filmed outside the North Korean embassy in Moscow. The Seoul Broadcasting System's crew was filming for a story about the defection of the North Korean ambassador to Egypt, Chang Sung-gil, when the men were surrounded by about 16 angry North Korean embassy staff. The staff demanded they stop filming and tried to take the tape. When the South Koreans refused, a fight ensued. They escaped by flagging down a passing Russian police car. SBS has made an official protest, but there's been no response so far. A chaotic accident scene in the heart of Hong Kong's business district. 2 people were killed and 12 injured when a police car careered down a hill and ploughed into office workers during lunch hour.
Witnesses said the accident happened so fast there was no time for the victims to get out of the way. A plainclothes detective was driving the car. He is said to have lost control of the vehicle, which hurtled into pedestrians at the junction of Wyndham Street and Queen's Road Central. It's the busiest part of Hong Kong's Central District. A Hong Kong newspaper later commented that the accident could have been avoided if overhead pedestrian crossings had been built. The paper blamed developers, who were accused of ignoring repeated reminders by the Lands Department to construct such bridges. Of the 2 killed, 1 was a 60-year-old woman. 12 others were injured, 3 critically. Police say the detective involved had been carrying out an urgent investigation into a deception case involving millions of dollars. They've impounded the car and are continuing their investigation to find a definite cause of the accident.
Police in central Japan are investigating the murder of one of the nation's biggest crime bosses. Masaru Takumi was gunned down in broad daylight in a Kobe hotel cafe. Takumi was the number 2 man for Japan's biggest underworld syndicate, the Yamaguchi-gumi. Such syndicates, known as Yakuza, number about 81,000 nationwide. Police suspect the attack on Takumi was carried out by a rival gang. 4 men disguised as workers walked into the cafe and fired about 10 shots at him, also critically injuring a bystander. Inspections are underway at the Tokaimuro plant following this week's disclosure of radioactive leaks at a storage facility there. The state-run agency DONNA, which runs Japan's nuclear program, has admitted that radiation has leaked from drums for as long as 30 years. But DONNA says the radioactivity has not spread outside the facility and no workers have been affected. Such assurances have not satisfied critics of the agency, however, who are furious over the latest admission. The 10th World Conference on Smoking has ended in Beijing with a call for all countries to stop using tobacco. Delegates at the 5-day conference called on all countries to list tobacco as a harmful substance and to try to stop production and consumption.
The conference was the first of its kind held in a developing country. The Chinese government says it's committed to reducing smoking, but the fact is it does make a lot of money from tobacco sales. Anti-smoking activists said that the conflict between economic and public health interests occurred in all developing nations, not just China. They hope the exchange of ideas between various nations will help anti-smoking efforts worldwide.
The conference has achieved worldwide recognition that there's an epidemic of tobacco use, and countries have come together and shared skills, techniques, data to really make a difference for everybody, all the delegates, to go back to their own countries and be able to apply new technologies so we can overcome the death and disease caused by tobacco use.
China has the world's largest number of smokers, 320 million. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of all Chinese males now under the age of 30 will die of smoking-related diseases. Although there's still a big lack of awareness about the health risks, change is taking place. This man says he wants to quit, but he has to do it slowly. He's aware that smoking is bad for his health. But both smokers and activists know that wanting to quit isn't always enough to win the fight against the habit.
Another clash between China and Taiwan. This time it's over an invitation extended to Taiwan by Panama. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has asked Panama to cancel its invitation to Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui. Lee is planning to attend a conference in Panama next month. China suspects Lee wants to lead Taiwan to outright independence and is determined to keep Taiwan diplomatically isolated. It's appealed to Panama to recognise its sovereignty claims over Taiwan. Cambodia's King Norodom Sihanouk has arrived in the North Cambodian town of Siem Reap. He says his mission is for peace and national reconciliation. Earlier, he said his goodbyes in Beijing, where he spent the last 6 months being treated for cancer and other illnesses. The king is casting himself as a neutral peacemaker in the ongoing struggle between his ousted son, Prince Ranariddh, and Hun Sen. The British government has been taking a hammering over its handling of the evacuation of residents on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Now one of its members of parliament has paid a visit to the volcano-devastated island as the residents devise ways to salvage their livelihoods.
The people of Montserrat have been calling on British politicians to visit them in their moment of crisis. And today Bernie Grant arrived on a mission, he said, to heal the wounds that have recently opened up between Britain and Montserrat. There's been, he said, too much megaphone diplomacy across the Atlantic.
We have to sit down face to face to discuss these issues. What I do not accept is that the British government can stay from Whitehall and determine what is necessary for the Montserratian people. What I am interested in doing is bringing people together so that we could sit down and talk about the situation.
The MP was flown by helicopter around the volcano itself and briefed by British scientists about its increasing danger. He also caught a glimpse of the devastation it's already caused. Now, though, some islanders believe they can turn to their advantage worldwide fascination with the Montserrat volcano. The island's tourist board have just launched a drive to attract holidaymakers who want to witness the awesome power of nature at first hand.
I'm the eternal optimist. And where other people see a negative, I see a positive. I see marketing this volcano as a challenge and something that can be sold.
There's even a tourist board plan to have a floating hotel anchored offshore so that holidaymakers here wouldn't have to risk their lives by staying on the island itself. It may sound bizarre, but it's also an indication of just how determined the islanders are to create opportunity out of adversity.
In the United States, there's been anxiety in central Florida over the threat of encephalitis. The virus, which can cause the disease, can be deadly, and it's been found in mosquitoes in the area. So far, there have been no reported cases in humans, but no one's taking any chances.
Mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. There's a lot of that around here, and health officials have been spraying insecticide around the clock. Everyone is being urged to cover up, use insect repellent, or even stay indoors at night when the mosquitoes are hungry.
When the bugs come out and those types of things, try to keep them inside.
Oh, it's very scary, and we just moved here.
A health alert was issued here on Monday after the virus was discovered in chickens who had been bitten by the mosquitoes.
We're on top of it. We're proactive. We're not waiting to react, and we're controlling the populations.
11 people died from encephalitis in Florida 7 years ago. But health officials say the virus discovered this year is much milder. And so far, not a single case has been reported in humans. Tourism is a $38 billion industry here, and Disney World and other attractions have taken the precautions of closing hotel swimming pools and water parks an hour before dusk. Health officials say the threat will go away by itself in November when the weather cools off and the mosquitoes die.
26 people were left hanging upside down from a roller coaster in Belgium after the ride broke down. No one was badly injured, but it took 2 hours for the rescue crews to free them.
This is the Sirocco train, a white-knuckle ride in a Brussels park that went wrong. As it looped the loop, it got stuck, and the passengers were left hanging, held by the safety harnesses on their seats. As efforts went on to rescue them, they had to wait. It was uncomfortable and terrifying, and the rescue effort seemed too slow for some. The precarious position of the carriages meant it was 2 hours before they could be brought down. The passengers just had to try to keep calm. What should have been a few minutes of fun had turned into a nightmare and was taking too long to end. Finally, the carriages were released after rescuers used cutting gear. The passengers were able to climb down to solid ground again, but after 2 hours upside down, they needed help. The emergency services said it was better to take time with the rescue than risk the lives of those who were trapped. The passengers got immediate medical care. They were very shaken, but no one appeared seriously affected. Some were even able to smile with relief. But it might be a while before they're keen to attempt a roller coaster ride again.
In Australia, the Senate is putting pressure on the federal government over tariffs for the textile, clothing and footwear industry. The opposition, minor parties and independent Senator Brian Harradine have passed a motion calling for a tariff freeze until the year 2005, claiming that would secure the future of 100,000 workers.
Another round of lobbying, the textile, clothing and footwear industry seeking assurances from John Howard.
I have lost my job, and that it's very hard now to survive on just one wage. And I told him that, you know, that there is something that he can do about that.
It would be the finish of the industry if the decision is not favourable. And it doesn't mean that we're going to walk away with our tail between our legs, I can tell you.
I listened very carefully, and I'll take into account what was put to me.
The Senate increased the pressure last night, calling for a freeze on tariffs until at least the year 2005, in line with the car industry.
It's a signal to the government that the Senate is of a mind to refuse any changes that they might care to put in place in the existing tariff regime.
TCF workers who rallied in Brisbane this morning hope the motion will boost their negotiating power. They fear the government will adopt the Industry Commission's draft recommendation to cut tariffs from 25% to 5% by the year 2008.
We've already seen the closures of DuPont, Burley, Clark's, a number of companies because of the uncertainty created.
When the Labor Party was in government, it cut tariffs regularly and boasted about it. And now it's shedding crocodile tears.
The Industry Commission's final report will be handed down in the next 2 weeks. Mr Howard has promised a very quick decision.
The Australian government has carried out its biggest ever survey of workers. The survey covered nearly 4,000 workplaces, and it shows Australians are working harder and longer, but that most are satisfied.
The notion of Australia as the land of the long weekend has all but disappeared. A snapshot of Australian working life shows those with work are putting in more hours. By contrast, there's a growing workforce of part-time and casual workers. Many of those can't get enough work. The survey also found most full-time employees now work around 44 hours a week, leaving less time for family and leisure. The added work pressure has resulted in fewer sickies, almost halved to 2.7% when the survey was taken in 1995, and falling levels of active unionism down to 18% of workers.
There are some challenges confronting the trade union movement. There are also quite a few opportunities that the report highlights, and there are opportunities that I think the trade union movement will well arrange itself so that it can take advantage of them.
Of most concern to people was the loss of family and leisure time. The survey shows 16-hour days aren't unusual for some.
I believe this is one of the great sort of issues confronting the workplace.
This survey has major political ramifications for the government. If these trends intensify, then the government could find itself the focus of a community backlash. The ACTU believes the Howard government's push towards individual contracts will heighten worker fears about job security and reduce leisure time even more.
The Workplace Relations Act is a quantum leap towards greater uncertainty, less assurity about the terms and conditions of employment that workers have.
Australia has the highest rates of part-time workers in the OECD, and the proportion of casual workers is rapidly increasing.
A new study reveals that many of the world's primates are in danger of being killed off. The World Watch Institute in Washington warns that if humans aren't more careful, our population explosion will wipe them out.
Scientists at the World Watch Institute say we face a future where our children may learn about monkeys and chimpanzees in the same way we learn about dinosaurs and other extinct species. They say almost half of the world's primates already face extinction, and nearly 20% more are close to endangered status. What was previously a slow decline has accelerated in the past 2 decades, mostly because of human destruction of rainforests.
All told, 90% of those threatened primate species are losing their habitat. And the concentrations of the most endangered primates correspond quite closely to areas of the planet where forests are disappearing most rapidly.
The World Watch Institute says that although monkeys and apes only live in certain areas, their survival is a global responsibility, which requires greater efforts to conserve their habitat.
Their continued survival ultimately depends most of all upon our own ability to build a sustainable society, to control our own population growth, to find alternatives to raw materials that are coming, that would otherwise have to come from remaining wildlands.
Mr. Tuxell says that unless action is taken, the world will lose not only animals, but their habitat. And that means the loss of other potential benefits, such as new sources for medicine or genes used in biotechnology.
Now to today's finance news. And as we saw earlier, the regional currency crisis continues to impact on stock markets, with Japan's Nikkei index ending just over 1% lower. The Hong Kong market took a dive, recording a massive 5% loss. Singapore's stock exchange saw prices shed more than 2% in value. Australia's All Ordinaries plunged 1.5%, spooked by the steep falls on Wall Street and Asian markets. The Aussie dollar was lower against the greenback. Hong Kong gold was steady, while Australian bullion ended the day marginally down. Now let's check the weather for the start of the weekend. And showers are tipped for Hong Kong and Hanoi, fine conditions elsewhere. Rangoon can expect storms with rain for Colombo and cloudy conditions in Dakar. Singapore, Manila and Kuala Lumpur can expect storms. Light rains predicted for Ho Chi Minh City, while the Cocos and Christmas Islands should be fine. The Pacific centres of Suva, Namur and Honiara can expect fine conditions. Fine weather too for Port Moresby and most of the Australian capitals, with only Adelaide expecting rain. Now, recapping tonight's main stories. The currencies and stock markets of the so-called Asian tiger economies have taken a battering for the second successive day. The Australian government has taken another step in its campaign to dispel perceptions in Asia that the country is racist. And there was traffic chaos in central Hong Kong when a police car careered out of control down a hill, ploughing into lunchtime crowds and killing 2 people. And that's the news from Australia Television for the moment. I'm Rosemary Church. Have a great weekend. Good night.
Thank you.